Okay, so I have a PowerPoint for today, and
Hmm.
so uh, I spent this last week at a conference on the Phaedo. We read through the Phaedo. That was here at the University of Brasilia, and it really gave me an idea about how Marinus, the way he describes Proclus's death, he's actually making him look a lot like Socrates.
Hmm.
So I'm gonna talk a bit about this, about how Proclus's death is a Socratic death, and that will be then like a natural way to introduce Damascus's commentary on the Phaedo, which will be the next text we'll
Hmm.
be looking
Okay.
at. Okay. So the death of Proclus has a Socratic death. So on the face of it, it doesn't seem that this is a very Socratic death, right? Because, Socrates, he dies because he's condemned to death unjustly um, by the city, and so there's a heavy political element there, which seems to be missing from Proclus. Proclus just dies of sickness, right? And he dies, as Marinus kind of puts it, through his own fault because he was so strict about his own desire for purity, right? So we saw this a few times, but for instance, it shows up this when he talks about how Asclepius loved him, right? When he was halfway between sleep and dreaming, he saw a serpent crawling about his head, from which moment the illness began to subside, and thus through the epiphany he enjoyed some remission of the illness. Indeed, had not his great and eager desire for death prevented it, had he deigned to give the appropriate care to his body, I believe that perfect health would have returned. So it seems that, he dies, and this death has to do with how he's detached from the world, whereas Socrates' death is about how he's involved in the world, right? And upset the wrong people. So this is a problem, but I think that there are some hints that point us to seeing how we can see that Proclus was also at least trying to imitate Socrates in his death, and at least Marinus is trying to show us that Proclus's death is Socratic. And this is like interesting, not just about how Marinus and Proclus understood Proclus or Socrates. It's not just interesting as it were, as how the text Phaedo is behind this text of the life of Proclus, but it's also interesting because it tells us a bit about how like the political ideals of Plato continue in Neoplatonism. So the first thing to note is the connection between happiness and death in those things. So in the Phaedo and from the beginning, Phaedo, who's narrating the whole thing, comments on how surprised he was that Socrates was died happily, right? And so here near the beginning, he says, although I was witnessing the death of one who was my friend, I had no feeling of pity, for the man appeared happy in both manner and words as he died nobly and without fear, Echecrates, so that it struck me that even in going down to the underworld, he was going with the god's blessing, and that he would fare well when he got there, if anyone ever does. And now, since Marinus doesn't quite give us an account of um, Proclus's final moments, the way that the Phaedo gives us of Socrates. But as we saw, his happiness and just how happy he was throughout his whole life, how he had a good life, not just in the sense of having lots of virtue and being a very good person, but also in having lots of luck and being born of good parents and having material wealth and so on is something that runs throughout the whole text. And Marinus himself even comments on this fact. So, right at the beginning, he says, I believe that the happiness of the blessed man is the most suitable foundation I can lay for my account, for I believe that he was the happiest man of all those who have acquired renown in many a long age. I am not speaking only of the happiness of the wise, though indeed he possessed that in the most eminent degree, nor of the fact that his portion of virtue was sufficient for his well-being, nor of that prosperity which is on the lips of the many, though again fortune provided him with this as much as any man, as he was liberally endowed with all the so-called external goods, No, the happiness that I want to speak of is perfect, without defect and consisting in both kinds. So both internal, virtuous, and external, of fortune and prosperity, he had, and not just the pure happiness of the wise, and not just happiness with some livelihood, but who was, very happy and very fortunate. So there's this connection of happiness and death in both. And the context is um, kind of like celebrating Proclus's life after his death. So there is something eulogistic to um, Marinus's account. So this is like one coincidence, and I'm starting from the most general things, and then I'll go to the more specific connections. Another very general thing is that they both live 70 years, right? Now, Proclus actually, he lives more than 70 years, but we're told that he only counted the first 70 years of his life as his actual life because he had this oracle that given to him by Plutarch, like in a dream that said you're going to live as much as how many tetrads, so like groups of 4 pages that you wrote about the Chaldean oracles, and those were 70 years. And then he says, for he lived, as I've said above, 70 years and a further five, but during the five he was no longer in good health. For that, again, and then Marinus insists on, in some sense, his responsibility. For that intolerably harsh diet of his, together with his frequent ablutions and other such austerities, had fatigued his body, despite its natural advantages, and it began to fail after his 70th year, becoming debilitated in all its activities, right? And then he goes on, therefore he recalled his dream with astonishment and kept on saying that he had lived only 70 years. And we know that Socrates lived only 70 years. In the Crito, it's mentioned explicitly. Interestingly, in the Crito, Socrates also has a dream about how long he's going to live, right? And so Crito is afraid that he's going to die on the day of the dialogue, but Socrates doesn't think so. So Socrates says, "May it be for the best, Crito. If it so please the gods, so be it that I die today. But I do not think it will arrive today." So the ship was going to arrive that day, and he's going to die the day after the ship arrives. And Crito said, what indication have you of this? I will tell you, I must die the day after the ship arrives. That is what those in authority say. Then I do not think it will arrive on this coming day, but on the next. I took to witness of this a dream I had a little earlier during this night. It looks as if it was the right time for you not to wake me. For the dialogue starts with Socrates waking up and finding Crito already there, and Crito explains, "Oh, I didn't want to wake you up. What was your dream? I thought that a beautiful and comely woman dressed in white approached me. She called me and said, Socrates, may you arrive at fertile Phthia on the third day. A strange dream, Socrates. It seems clear enough to me, Crito." So again, there's this coincidence. Both men have their dreams have their deaths foretold by a dream. And now to focus in more, we can actually think of Proclus's death as also being pagan, as also being political, because it was, really explicitly pagan. Why does he die? Because of his frequent ablutions and other such austerities, right? Because he is holding on to these religious practices, right? And we think of this in the context of a growing Christianization of the society, and Christianity is becoming more and more popular. And this is something that's really present for Proclus and in Marinus's account of his life, right? So there's this, for instance, there's the episode where he has to leave Athens for like a year because of Christian agitation. It's not really clear what it is. And there's also this case here about how Athena chooses to move in with him, right? How dear he himself was to the philosopher goddess is sufficiently established by his choice of the philosophical life, which was as such as my account reveals. But the goddess herself also indicated it plainly when her statue, which at that time was situated in the Parthenon, was displaced by those who move even the immovable, right? So this is an account. What happened was that Christians moved the statue in the Parthenon to Constantinople For it seemed to the philosopher in a dream that he was approached by a woman of fair aspect who announced that he must prepare his house as quickly as possible. For the mistress of Athens, she said, desires to live with you. So it's Athena as the goddess of the city that comes to, in some sense, live with him. And Christian Wildberg, in a chapter in that volume from Cambridge, All from One, he connects this to this archaeological find at the house of Proclus, which was of a sacrifice of a piglet, and the skeleton of the pig is found entire. So this wasn't eaten, right? And so it was clearly killed and then buried with this kitchenware, this earthenware, which is perfectly preserved. None of this has been used, and you see that there are seven cups, with the number seven is sacred to Athena, and this lamp, right? So it's a symbol of light, right? And it's also has not been used. And it's all buried there. And he argues that this was a sacrifice made to Athena in order to prepare and purify the house for her coming. And he shows how piglets were used to sacrifice temples and sacred spaces. And in the Eumenides, um, Orestes also there's this classical antecedent of Orestes killing a piglet to purify himself for the arrival of Athena. So his insistence the on his pagan practices can be seen as also like political in the sense I'm sticking to the traditions in a time when the traditions are being abandoned by so many people. And we can also think of like the emphasis on Proclus's happiness in Marinus's biography in this way. It's like you can you can still be happy, like the society seems to be closing in on us, but look, the happiest man in the world is a pig, right? So you shouldn't take heart and be faithful to Platonism and the gods. Um, and it's interesting also this connection of Athena as the mistress of Athens, the goddess of the city, because this is also something that Marinus emphasizes at the beginning of the biography, right? When he's saying he's talking about uh, Proclus's parents, but then he says his nurse and midwife, as it were, was the tutelary goddess of Byzantium, who first became the cause of his existence at this time, since he was born in her city and subsequently took care that he should turn out well when he came to boyhood and adolescence. For she, appearing to him in a dream, exhorted him to philosophy. This, I think, is the reason for his strong association with the goddess, so that he celebrated her festivals particularly and observed her rites with great enthusiasm. We discussed how some scholars don't see this as Athena, but especially because it's the same one that exhorted him to the dream and to do philosophy, it seems that it is really Athena. And so she is, this first association with her is as goddess of a city, not goddess of Athens. She's goddess of more than one city. Here it's Byzantium, already at this time called Constantinople, but Marinus is the traditionalist, so we'll call it Byzantium. And so he's um, uh, and so there is this connection of Athena as a city goddess, and this stuff about being a nurse and a midwife is not um, is not accidental. So let me first talk about how Proclus does believe that there are gods of the cities, right? So that each city has its own god. This is probably a daimon, right? Elsewhere he calls these things daimones, right? So this is in his discussion of 10 doubts of providence, and his explanation, it's part of his explanation for why there's ancestral fault. So actually, why do you have to purify a city or a family after because of a crime of an ancestor, and why if that doesn't happen, you can be punished for the crime of an ancestor. And he says every city and every clan constitutes one single living being, more so than every single person, being to a large degree immortal and sacred. For one single civic deity presides over the city as over one single being. and one ancestral deity over the clan as one whole. And there is a single cycle in common for the city and one for the clan, which always makes the life and the customs of each of them converge, different ones for different cities and clans, as if the life in these were synchronized, and also always makes their different body sizes, different resources, postures, motions converge, as if one single nature were pervading the whole city and every single clan in it, making both that city and that clan one. If then their providence is one, and their fate with respect to these things is one, and if their life is of the same form, and if their nature from the same root, how could one refuse to call the state and the clan one living being, and from now on to talk specifically about each of them as one, since when compared to any one of us, each of them is a living being that is longer lived, more divine, and more like the universe, and that it encompasses the other smaller living beings and is akin to the everlasting. So here it's interesting. So he thinks that like a single city or a single clan, right, like a family spanning many generations, since it has common customs and also like the people there, they're similar to each other. They have similar shapes and postures, and they talk, and they have similar rhythms, right? So that they're synchronized. This can involve, having uh, common days of rest, common days of work, or common holidays, and inside the customs, the nomoi or the of a group are not just ancestral laws, but also things like their language. So, and this is like part of a bigger idea in late antiquity that's often discussed as nation angels, right? That each nation and each group has its own angel or deity. The rationale for this in Proclus, as far as I can tell, is is something like the city is a natural phenomenon. Family and the city are natural phenomena, right? Following Aristotle. It's part of human nature that you have to group in you have to have these larger groups with laws, and if you're going to fulfill your human nature, not just, to survive, all you need is a family, right? And slaves, and family including slaves. But you need also, more people, and if you're going to be happy, right? However, so these are natural phenomena. On the other hand, individual human beings are more often than not irrational, right? They're more often than not, each of them is an independent rational soul that is free to do as it wills, but also because of the general scheme of the world, most people have to be irrational, so that they're reborn as animals, right? The argument I often mention. So in order for like human race and for the human cities to be natural phenomena, they have to have a nature of their own that's somehow independent of all the individuals that make it up, right? And then to account for that nature, you're going to and for the stability of that nature, you need to say that there's some daimon that takes care of it, right? And and so that's generally the idea. But the idea, in a sense, goes all the way, like this argument goes, in some sense, goes all the way back to Plato, and it goes back to the Crito, right? So in the Crito, there's this famous dialogue of like that Socrates imagines between himself and the laws. Like if he decided to run away, what would the laws say to him, right? And how could he defend himself against what they say? And so, not quoting the whole dialogue here, but here just one part. She says, so these are the laws they're saying. Reflect now, Socrates, that if what we say is true, you are treating us rightly by planning to do what you are planning. We have given you birth, nurtured you, educated you, right? So here they've made the point, philosophers made the point that like Socrates' parents married according to Athenian laws. He was, in became a citizen according to Athenian laws. The laws about how he should be, like the laws determined how he should be educated and that he should be nurtured, right? So he is not, some kind of self-created entity, but who he is like created by the laws in a sense even more than his natural parents because the laws determined how the parents did those things. Think about the Aristotelian idea about like what is the unmoved mover, well, that when a patient recovers, it's not the drug, which is a moved mover that was destroyed when he took it. It's also not even the body of the doctor, it's the art of medicine in him, right? Because that's what determined what the doctor would say and do. And that doesn't change during this whole process. So it's the art of medicine that's the unmoved mover in all this. So also here in Socrates being brought up, the unmoved mover, the true cause is the laws of the city, right? We have given you and all other citizens a share of all the good things we could, right? And and so there's this idea that it's the laws of the city that they are the true causes, and they're the causes that are independent of the individuals, right? So this all goes back to this idea that Athena was the nurse and midwife of Proclus. And of course, since Athena is the goddess of Athens, she is who would be the laws, right? If the laws were personified, it would be Athena. And and it's following these laws that Socrates dies, right? So there's something again that both Proclus and Socrates, they both die following the ancestral laws, right? Now there's a difference here because this is like in Socrates' case, it seems to be very much a case of political virtue, following the laws of the city, whereas in Proclus' case, it seems to be a case of purificatory virtue. However, the Phaedo is about purification. It's in the Phaedo that we find the claim all virtues are purifications. And so if in one level, like in Crito, the Apology, Socrates argues on a political level for why he should, why he's okay with dying. In the Phaedo, we find that for him too, this following the laws has to do with being a good philosopher, separating the soul from the body, and things like that. And what we'll be doing when we look at Damascus's commentary on the Phaedo is seeing how Neoplatonists took up these ideas. I've been talking a lot. I'll pause in a minute for you to ask questions and things. But so and now Athena is one of three gods that um, Marinus mentions that Proclus was specifically close to, right? He also mentions Asclepius and also the mother of the gods, Cybele. So I want to mention those two and connect them to these issues. So Asclepius is present at both the death of Socrates and Proclus. So Asclepius famously appears at the end of the Phaedo, right? So as his belly was getting cold, Socrates uncovered his head, he covered it and said these were his last words, Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius, make this offering to him and do not forget. So very puzzling. There have been like over 20 interpretations, and there are more every day of what this meant. Why do they owe this cock to Asclepius? Um, and whatever the meaning of that, Asclepius also shows up um, at Proclus's final illness, right? So as for his affinity with Asclepius, that was indicated first by the act just mentioned, but we were also persuaded by the epiphany of the god in his final illness, right? Read this earlier. And Marinus gives us a few other incidents, right? How he prays to Asclepius for him to heal Asclepigeneia, and also how he is at Adrata, and people aren't really sure who the temple there belongs to, if it's the twins, Castor and Pollux, or if it's Asclepius, and then praying there, he finds out that it's Asclepius. So like Asclepius keeps trying. And during this whole presentation, I've been really inspired by specifically one talk that happened at the conference by Esteban Bieda, who's a philosopher at the University of Buenos Aires. And he really brought out one really interesting. I mean, he drew my attention to the Crito, but he also drew attention to how Asclepius in Plato is a statesman. Asclepius is has a political function, right? So for instance, in the Republic, he's talking about how Asclepius cured people and what was his medical practice. Therefore, won't we say that Asclepius knew this, and that he taught medicine for those whose bodies are healthy in their natures and habits, but have some specific disease? His medicine is for these people with these habits. He cured them of their disease with drugs or surgery, and then ordered them to live their usual life so as not to harm their city's affairs. But for those whose bodies were riddled with disease, he didn't attempt to prescribe a regimen, drawing off a little here and pouring in a little there in order to make their life a prolonged misery and enable them to produce offspring in all probability like themselves. He didn't think that he should treat someone who couldn't live a normal life, since such a person would be of no profit either to himself or to the city. The Asclepius you're talking about was quite a statesman, right? So there's something political about how Asclepius heals. He's not just like a general god of healing, he's a god of healing for the city, for people to fulfill their duties. And so that's a connection that we so this brings in another political element to both the deaths of Socrates and of Proclus, that they die and they are and in some sense they are not healed in order for their them to because it's their time, and it's been their time to fulfill they've done what they need to do for the city. Um, and finally, the other goddess that he mentions is the Great Mother, right? Which Proclus apparently even wrote a book about. And this can also be seen in the context of like how Proclus's death was in some sense of fidelity, and Proclus's death, not only his death, versus life, is a question of fidelity um, to the pagan traditions in an increasingly pagan world, because the Great Mother and her rites specifically were like one thing that Christians focused on. It's like this is particularly uh, and a particularly absurd pagan belief, right? These people, they castrate themselves, they shout and they say things that no one can understand, right? And apparently, Proclus even uh, dealt specifically with this, so like that the ear is no longer troubled. The text goes on to say by the inarticulate lamentations, right? Because the priests of the goddess would lament the death of Attis, right? Her consort every year, and so he wrote about specifically these things. So it's kind of like a pagan apology if you're writing about the Great Mother. So these three gods that um, gods and goddesses that Marinus brings in, they really emphasize this, what I've been calling the political character of Proclus's death, and then why we can see it as somehow Socratic. Um, now, right. Now, so that's my general presentation about how Proclus had this Socratic death. Before we move on to the Phaedo, let me pause here for you to ask questions, make plot points, and things like
Hmm. Yeah. One, one thing. Just to the last thing, there is of course like it at least rhymes with like devotion to the Virgin Mary and that whole thing, the Great Mother. I did like a Google search and it brought me like 3 books written about this, but I don't know if they're
Yeah, no, but this is also like a reason why Christians were upset by this, because like the Great
okay.
Mother and Attis looks like Virgin Mary and Jesus, and so we don't, they were upset at that. There's also, I mean, I found this researching for this, but it ended up not in my presentation, that in Proclus's text, he refers to our Lord Hermes and our Lord Dionysus. Now, I did a simple search for these terms in the nominative and the accusative in the TLG, right? In the copy of the TLG that I have, which is not the most current version, but it does have like old classical authors and it has a bunch of Christian authors. And outside of Proclus, our Lord is a Christian expression, basically. It's our Lord Jesus Christ. And so I mean, that might be a different scheme of things, of like, I mean, that might be like a different way that we can see some kind of resistance to the Christian way of talking, right? Our Lord is Hermes and our Lord is Dionysus. And specifically, the Our Lord Hermes connects specifically with what Marinus tells us that he had this vision or dream where he understood that he belonged to to the chain of Hermes, right? Our Lord Dionysus connects with the idea that Dionysus is the king of the world, right? He's the Lord of, and he's specifically the human intellect is a Dionysian intellect. So this doesn't, that's something I hope to explore later. But there's um, so this idea, so that's a different way that, he's contrasting himself with the Christians. We see this in Proclus's own texts.
Um, yeah, okay. The more important thing this is this question of Socrates' death, like Socrates' martyrdom, if you want.
Yeah,
And there's like these opposite aspects of it, right? Um,
right.
on the one hand, like this is like the great passion of philosophy, right? Where like he
Right.
dies for
Yeah.
his following his questioning, or the accusation says, leading people to disbelieve the gods of the city and so on. And and the other hand, there's the precise opposite thing, which is all the credo and other places where it's all about like he actually dies in submission to the city because he should have escaped. And there's this whole justification of this in the credo, and even in the apology, in some sense, it seems to like justify his submitting to the city and so on. Um, so I guess this has to do with this, I don't know, with this like question of maybe in some sense the distinction between the two levels of virtue, where like there is the purificatory or even like higher virtues, which are like entirely universal. And then you have political virtue, and we discussed a few times how these things might conflict in some sense. That's one thing. The other way of talking about this would be, which is not the way we're learning usually, but like there's a question I was thinking of talking about. So Socrates presents, at least in the Apology, and many people take this to be the main like Socratic teaching, like the skepticism. I don't know if skepticism, but more questioning, right? Questioning everything, and um, being not knowing, right? All of that. And on the other hand, he seems to be pretty certain about his actions, right? He is not really a person that wavers. His whole thing is like, we don't waver. He follows his daimon, wherever it tells him to go. He even follows his city, right? He fights in wars for Athens. And we get into the whole discussion of his courage and all of that. And he dies because the city decreed that he dies, and he's like, that's the correct thing to do. And that seems to be very like the opposite of what people take Socraticism to be. Like you should never trust your city. Like, why is my city correct? But like people ask this question, right? If Socrates is somewhat questioning, how is he sure that? And he even claims that all wars are about disputes over justice. And then he shouldn't be fighting for Athens ever. Like maybe the other side is just. Like there's there isn't really a justification for this. It's just like he thinks that it's correct to follow his cities. Um, I saw people giving different like theories of this. But anyways, like there's some kind of I don't know. There's either some kind of tension or something the opposite of this, where somehow the like philosophizing and all of that is somehow leads him to let's say follow the god of the city or something like that, which is I don't know how to articulate, but there's something to go over there. Does that make sense? My
Yeah, I think it does. I think what there is here is there's a kind of I mean, the case of Socrates' death is interesting because it seems that it shows not a case of conflict between political and purificatory, but agreement, right? So there's the political case for his death, and that's the Crito and the Apology. And then there's the purificatory case for his death, right? Which is then the what's in the Phaedo, right? And those both agree. It's also interesting that you can say that he's in a sense he's being like his accusers. They are the ones betraying the city, right? Because they're depriving it of philosophy, right? They're killing Socrates, and he is the one who's true to the real city, right? And he's being faithful to the laws, and he's not, he is not betraying the laws because those people have done harmed him, right? It's not because they are doing something bad that he's going to do something bad. Um, and I think that we can think of, uh, and it's, I mean, we can think that there's maybe some similar distinction in the minds of Marinus and Proclus, that there's the real city, like sustained by Athena and the gods, and then there's the corrupt city, which is the Christianized city, right? And so there could be something of this uh, distinction. It's interesting to think about like what does political like and what does political virtue look like when you have a distinction like this, right? Because it's since there is this distinction, then political virtue isn't going to be simply like it's not going to just going to be simply being a good citizen as opposed to a good person, right? Rather, you should always be a good person because presumably the true city is good, right? Something like that. And you shouldn't, do something bad because the city orders you to do it. How this squares with Socrates fighting in the wars is unclear, but that seems to be an element that complicates things. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, so that's
Like I was thinking one thought that I had, which is I think in Socrates in some way, is that this like questioning should somehow leads to taking loyalties more seriously, not the opposite. Because Socrates has this thing with like basing on self on agreement, and if you don't have knowledge or something like that, where like if there would be, and he says take something in the apology, the same like when he justifies his not being afraid of death, he says I'm not afraid of death because I don't know if death is good or bad. So how could I like it wouldn't make sense. Like there's like this like weird way in which like this sort of skeptical stance leads you to be more okay with the like being sure, or at least sure in action, like about fighting in a war, or like if it would be very easy to know what the truth is, like what's his name? Uh, like the priest over there not thinks he knows, then he might think maybe my city is wrong. But since it's really not, nobody really knows what justice is, or at least Socrates doesn't think he knows, then he should be fighting for his city, something like that, because that's his promise. Or then we have this like thing where like he belongs to it and all of that. Uh,
right.
does that make?
Yeah, because that it could be, it's yeah. Um, the argument of Crito doesn't seem to depend on you knowing that your city is just, right? it seems to be. You you have this dependence on it, and you're not really individual. So you would, in some sense, be lying to yourself if you know, judged your city and you said, "Oh, this decision with my city is wrong, so I should leave it." Right? Because I mean, like, it's no the case of I will refuse to fight for my city, and so I will desert and I will leave, I will flee, I'll run away from a death sentence. They seem to be very parallel in that respect. Um, but you remind me also of like the questioning, right? And you can, and that's like something that some people might think is like a big difference between Proclus and Socrates. In the sense that it seems that, you know, Proclus has like this theory, he knows a bunch of things, and he's praised as someone who taught these things and as someone who had these, you know, insights into the truth and so on. So first off, I mean, like the Neoplatonists, they really, I think that they have like a higher, they have like a high Socratology, or they do think that like Socrates does have a more complete philosophical theory and something more close to how Plato, you know, presents him in the dialogues as knowing all these things, knows the forms and so on. And so they're and like his professions of ignorance and that he doesn't know anything is that he's holding himself up to like the standards of the gods. So he doesn't have divine knowledge and things. So so they have that. And on the other hand, like from what we know about how philosophy was taught in at the academy in Proclus's day and after him, it was still done on questions and arguments, right? It was still, I mean, that was how he did it. And um and you can also think that the again, since he's defending a belief that's like a minority belief, it's something that you really need to shore up with arguments and that people aren't sure about, and so you have to, you know, you can't just rely on tradition, right? You know, to I don't know, follow Athena in this day and age. Um, so there is something also Socratic. There's in that sense. Um, okay, but like this is
Like just like one more way to say it, like would be like the like one of the like searches is like for like this difference between law and custom, like fit between physical law, like for nature and custom. And then you end up saying something like, but it's natural for people to have customs, and therefore like these customs have real existence. Like there is a form of them, or at least a diamond of them. Unlike what someone would sort of otherwise say, where like this whole search for laws in distinction to nomos, to the custom of people. And they say, well, then laws or customs are just conventions. It turns out they're not really just conventions, or that's not a way to get away from them.
right, right. So that connects with the argument for the city gods that have been brought in
Yeah,
earlier. Yeah, yeah. Um, Also, yeah, it's also the problem of saying things like, "Oh, a language is just a convention." Doesn't okay? There's specific linguistic conventions, but speaking languages doesn't seem to be like that. Insofar as a language is necessary for you to speak languages at all, there's something natural in them. It's like that. Okay, but let's start getting closer to the Phaedo. So, the Phaedo we talked was like really important for Proclus's education, and it seems to be because it was like the first thing that he studied at the academy after On the Soul, right? So when he arrived at the academy in Athens, Plutarch took him to as his student, and Marinus tells him that with him, Proclus read Aristotle's On the Soul and Plato's Phaedo, right? So again, Aristotle the lesser mysteries and Plato the higher mysteries. The great man also exhorted him to write down what was said, making an instrument of his zeal, saying that when these notes were completed, there would be treatises on the Phaedo in Proclus's name. Um, He was also delighted in other respects by his experience of the young man's aptitude for liberal studies, constantly calling him his son, making him share his hearth. And when he perceived that he was stoutly committed to abstinence from live creatures, he enjoined him not to abstain from these completely, so that his body also might subserve the activities of his soul. He also gave the same injunctions to the philosopher Syrianus concerning the young man's diet. The latter replied to the old man, as that divine personage related to me, let him learn what I wish, living abstemiously, and then, if he wishes, let him die. Such, on all occasions, was his teacher's solicitude for him. So, this brings in the case that, from the very beginning, Proclus's teachers are like really surprised about how ascetic he is, and they're concerned about him. And, this is part of what like shows that Proclus isn't a model human being, he's a model philosopher. But a philosopher is someone who's already living their next life, is someone who doesn't want to be a human being, they want to be a star. And so they have, as it were, inhuman habits, and in this case, these strict dietary practices that in the end contribute to his death. So and so these come up when reading the Phaedo. Of course, the Phaedo says that the philosopher should die, right, and should want to die, right? And that he shouldn't kill himself, but that he should want to die. So I think it's interesting for us to, in order to better understand this death wish and what's going on here, to take a look at the Phaedo, the arguments there, that and especially how it's interpreted by Damascius. So, I mean, this comes up right at the beginning of the Phaedo when uh, uh, Socrates tells Cebus to tell Avienus to join him in his death, right? And Simmias asks, what kind of advice is this you are giving to Avienus, Socrates? I've met him many times, and from my observation, he is not at all likely to follow it willingly. How so? Is Avienus not a philosopher? I think so. But Avienus will be willing, like every man who partakes worthily of philosophy. Yet perhaps he will not take his own life, for that, they say, is not right. And so there's this tension right at the beginning of the Phaedo that you have to want to die, but you have to desire death, but you can't kill yourself. Right. And the Phaedo then starts off with um, um, practice with the argument for why you shouldn't commit suicide, and then it goes on to the question about how, in what sense does the philosopher want to die? How he has to be willing to follow someone into death, and then we get the immortality of the soul and the myth. The parts about the immortality of the soul and the myth we don't need to go into, but we'll be dealing just with this first part about the argument about suicide and the argument about death, right? And about death in philosophy. And then this is, as it were, central text for Platonic philosophers about how it is to live. And in Damascus's commentary, he dedicates a lot of time talking about the virtues in this context, right? So the argument about, so let me talk about um, the commentary a bit, and then we'll go back. So Damascus is a generation after Proclus, right? I mean, he meets Proclus as an old man still, and he succeeds. He's not Proclus's immediate successor, but he eventually becomes the head of the Platonic Academy, and he's the head of the Platonic Academy at 529 when it's closed by Justinian. And his reading of the Phaedo, the Phaedo is often called like Phaedo or on the soul, Phaedo or on the immortality of the soul. But for the Neoplatonists, it wasn't about that. It was about the purificatory life in general. Because they had this idea that the skopos, right, the target or theme of a dialogue to which all its elements have to be associated, has to be a single thing. And of course, the arguments for the immortality of the soul occupied the greater part of the Phaedo. But it's also the account of Socrates' death, and there's also the myth at the end, right? And so there has to be something common that unites all these things. And their idea was that it's this idea of purification. And Damascus' commentary on the Phaedo is a super commentary on Proclus's commentary. So that's interesting. So as we read Damascus on the Phaedo, we're going to be looking at both what Proclus says and then what Damascus says to correct him. Right. So that seems like this was his thing. Proclus's commentary existed as a text, hasn't arrived to us, unfortunately. And so Damascus will often say, he says, the philosopher says, the commentator says, something like that. Or sometimes he doesn't even give, say, a he says, it just gives a thing. And then Damascus corrects it. He says, rather, da 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 da. Okay. And so he corrects it. So it's a super commentary. And also it's a reported commentary. So it's not a text like Proclus' commentary on the Parmenides or on the Timaeus, which is a text that Proclus himself wrote, and that is fluid, right? It just goes, it's organized. Damascus' commentary on the Phaedo is organized into small chunks, and they all start with that hoti, 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 because they're student notes. It's a reported commentary. And this has a few consequences. So it means so there we have an advantage that we have actually two reports of the same class, right? So there's Damascus commentary on Plato's Phaedo 1 and 2. We'll be reading through through 1 because it's the more extensive one. He goes into more detail. The student took more notes, but sometimes the 2 is useful for comparison and to help us read the 1. We also have Olympiodorus's commentary on the same uh, um, on the same text, and it seems that Olympiodorus took also, taught on the base of Proclus's text. And although Damascus very often will correct Proclus, he it could very well be that he just didn't discuss things that he thought Proclus discussed very well. So it's significant that in the commentary on Plato's Phaedo, it's almost all about the arguments. There's some stuff about the drama and things, but far less than what Proclus probably would have written, right? So, like sometimes in Plato's Phaedo, Phaedo stops the narration and there's like a short dialogue between him and Echecrates who's listening. And in Proclus's commentaries, this kind of moment is useful to like see the characters as symbols of divine of how causes work, or that's containing some kind of moral behind it. We get very little of this in Damascus's commentary. So, and I think it's probably because he thought, oh, Proclus dealt with this well. Like in he also has a commentary um on the Parmenides. And in the Parmenides, he explicitly says, Proclus dealt with this well, so I won't talk about it. Um, so that's the work. Now, the structure of the work is like this. So the prologue with Phaedo and Echecrates talking, and which is like also where he would have argued for the scopus of the text, and all this is missing, right? Our text starts in the middle of a discussion of the argument on suicide, right? So the text as a whole, it has, as it were, three parts. First part on that Wester ink has divided into three parts. The first is on death, the second on immortality, and the third on the myth. We'll just be focusing on death. These are not page numbers, not to worry. These are paragraph numbers. And so it starts with the on suicide. And here there's a distinction between the esoteric argument and the exoteric argument. So to explain this, let's take a step back and see the Socrates on the prohibition of suicide. So he says, indeed, said Socrates, it does seem unreasonable when put like that, but perhaps there is a reason to it, the prohibition to commit suicide. There is the explanation that is put in the language of the mysteries that we men are in a kind of prison, and that one must not free oneself or run away. That seems to me an impressive doctrine, and one not easy to understand fully. However, Cebes, this seems to me well expressed. that the gods are our guardians, and that the men are one of their possessions. Or do you not think so? I do, said Cebes. And would you not be angry if one of your possessions killed itself, when you're not given any sign that you wished it to die? And if you had any punishment you could inflict, you would inflict it? Certainly, he said. Perhaps then, put in this way, it is not unreasonable that one should not kill oneself before God had indicated some necessity to do so, like the necessity now put upon us. So interestingly, like a god indicated some necessity of the current necessity of Socrates' death. We can think here about, divinity of the laws, his daimon, the dream, right? And but anyway, there are two explanations here. There's first the one that is put in the language of the mysteries, that we are in a kind of prison, right? That's one argument. And then that the gods are our guardians, and that men are one of their possessions, that's the exoteric argument. Let's say, as it were, the philosophical argument, right? At least that's how the Neoplatonists read this, and that's why there's two parts to the commentary on this prohibition. Um, on the esoteric argument and the exoteric argument. Um, so, and then there's a discussion about the will to die, right? So, Cebes and Simmias have questions about this, and then there's Socrates' answer. Then there's that syllogism on death, which he gives the definition of death. Death is separation of this body and the soul, and each of them being themselves. And then the philosopher wants to live by himself, and therefore he wants to die. Then the whole discourse on detachment, how you have to detach yourself from pleasures, even from perception, and why you do this for noesis, because separated from the body, you have noesis, knowledge of the forms better. And then there's a discussion that what is true philosophy? Philosophy is purification. There and then the mini monograph on the virtues by Damascius, where he will give us a complete view of what the virtues are and all the different levels of virtues. And then the discussion that philosophy is initiation, that comparison of the philosopher as the true Bacchus. And that's also one of the places where Damascus talks about the division amongst Platonists, among people who prefer philosophy and people who prefer um,
Theurgy.
theurgy. Exactly. So that's like the what we'll be looking at. We'll just be looking at this part on death, and um and yeah, and hopefully that should explain to us a bit more about this death wish of Proclus's, and also the just we'll be learning more about Neoplatonic virtue.
Okay.
Um okay,
Um,
so um we still have time. It's just 1 o'clock. So we can start with the text. Um there's some so let me see. In the book, this is page hmm, page 26. You have the PDF?
yeah.
Right. So it's a bit unfortunate, like that at the very beginning there a um like
Mhm.
the first passage is about is corrupt, but after that it gets more uh smooth. Do you want to start just
Okay.
reading?
I should just read the word. Well, yeah. Okay.
Start
So,
from the esoteric argument, and and yeah, and just read this first paragraph. When you get to a gap, just say something like there's a gap.
okay. So it starts with a gap. Opinions and show what is the true interpretation. Okay. So it probably says something like, I'll give the other people's opinions on the correct one. In the first place, then, the reason must be peculiar to the original problem and not of general application, since it says the reason given for this in esoteric doctrine. That's the saying that people are in prison, right? The soul is in prison.
Yeah,
Um,
so the reason given for this, for the prohibition of suicide. Yeah. So that's the
so it can't be like a reason for everything, or I don't know, for a lot of things.
yeah, indeed.
Um, Secondly, it must not be obvious and within easy reach, or it would not be referred to as esoteric, deep, or not easy to grasp. Okay, there needs to be something uh, hard, complicated about this. Thirdly, the mystic reason must command greater reverence than the philosophical account, which Socrates feels justified in revealing because it is esoteric. Accordingly, if the philosophical account proceeds from the multitude of gods, the others must have the other, so the mystical, the seek as esoteric one, must have a monad as its starting point. Hmm.
Right. So that here he's picking up something on the language there. That in the Phaedo he says, we are possessions of the gods when he talks about the exoteric argument, the philosophical one. And so he's saying, well, there, so the principle there is the gods, and since the esoteric reason has to be somehow superior, well, unity is above multiplicity, so it should be start with the monad, right?
And is that in the language? Where did we have the language that it says what it says by the other thing, by the
No, so the other one is here, let me share this again. So this is entirely reconstruction, because the one that is in the language of the mysteries is just that we are in a kind of prison that one must not free oneself or run away. There, he doesn't mention the gods or a god here at
mm,
all,
okay.
right? And it's but when he talks about the exoteric argument, he says the gods are our guardians.
Okay.
And so Props
So
is saying if he says the gods and the exoteric, here it must he must be thinking of a god, a monad of those gods. Right?
mhm. Okay. Fourthly, the multitude here must be continuous with the monad there. The characteristics of that something should not be disparate. So of these two things, I guess. For abrupt transition is against scientific method.
Right. So Plato is always obeys scientific method, right? And there's part of scientific method, um, right? It, right. Here he doesn't use method, it's not scientific to have an immediate transition. So, and this is like part of Proclus's interpretation of Plato, that what's special about Plato is that he finds the exact place of each thing in the causal hierarchy, right? So he doesn't just say that eternity is always existing. Rather, Proclus thinks that it's proper to Plato that he's found out that eternity is in the second intelligible triad, right? And so that part of this, of being scientific, is that you have this continuous causal sequence. And therefore, there should be a continuity between the monad there and the multitude in the second argument. So I guess this is like a further thing to say that it's going to be the monad of that multitude. Right.
Right. It shouldn't be like there needs to be a distinction, but it needs to be somehow on the same level or in the same class.
Right. Yeah.
Um, Fifthly, the something something demonstration results in the particular something something kept in custody something something. I don't know. Uh, is the body or the soul kept in custody? The reason should be visibly connected with something something because even for the body custody something something, it is described as a certain custody, i.e., as it were something something. Either there's a possibility something something, or because being equipped for knowledge something something. And the tenth place, oh, that's then we're skipping six things here.
Yeah. So we have fifth,
Oh,
and like the translator, he tries to reconstruct many of these, but it's very speculative. Some like the fifth one, he I think is plausible because he says, fifthly, the like logical demonstration results, it should be like something like, fifthly, the esoteric should be universal because logical demonstration results in the particular, right? Something like that. So it's demonstration seems to be connected to the second argument. So if the second argument is somehow particular, the esoteric argument should be universal, something like that.
Hmm.
After that, it gets really tricky, and we have to somehow find the sixth, the seventh, the eighth, and the ninth. Um, and this is and then there it just seems really um, uh, speculative for me. I'll read you the thing. So it's in the footnote. So he says, let me close this. Well, I'll leave the text open. So he says, actually, sixthly, it is with human souls kept in custody that the discourse is concerned. Right? All we have is kept in custody for that. Seventhly, the
Hmm.
reason should be visibly connected with corporeal being, because even for the body, custody is needed. Don't really uh, uh, see how that contributes. Eighthly, ninthly, eighthly, he has no speculation. Ninthly, it is described as a certain custody that is, as it were, particular and individual, or this may be because there is a possibility of escape, or because being equipped for knowledge of the universal, souls cannot easily discern it. Again, even he admits that this number nine is really questionable.
Hmm.
But then we get to the 10th one. Right. You can read.
Okay, in the 10th place, the reason belongs to the initiatory order of things and should be ranked neither higher nor lower. Which reason? The
The esoteric reason, right? The
okay.
esoteric. Um,
And what is the
yeah.
initiatory order?
So here it's the initiatory particularity. Um, I guess what he's saying is that there should be some kind of, the reason here has to be somehow be connected with initiation, or that's all he's saying. So,
Hmm.
gods that are connected with initiation, so with things like elusis that free us from this world, from death, and so on.
Okay.
And here also this word that he keeps using, frura, right? So custody. So custody is what in the translation in the Cooper volume is translated here as a prison. Now, prison there's another word for Greek for prison in Greek, which is desmoterion. And um, Plato doesn't use that word here. He uses it a lot in other contexts, but here he uses just frura. And frura can mean prison, but it can also mean like a guard post. And so there's like debate amongst in the literature since antiquity, actually, that some people read this as a prison. So like you're a prison and you can't run away. Others are as like you're put in a as a at a post as a guard and you can't abandon your post, right? You can't abandon your charge, right? So um, and so like Cicero reads it like that, and many contemporaries read it like that. There's also the important here, something that Proclus picked up on here, that he says fruratis, so it's a kind of prison, certain prison, right? Or a certain custody. So that's the that's going to be an issue that he's going to raise right now in the next paragraph.
Okay. So like general principle of all of these arguments is something like that esoteric reasons versus exoteric ones always have to mean something like conforming to different levels of reality in the like Neoplatonic system. Like it's not like this is something hard to reveal or something like that. It's always something which is really like in a higher level of reality.
Yeah, like specifically about this argument. So if we're going to reconstruct what the uh, argument in the language of the mysteries is supposed to be, it's going to have to be something that's peculiar to why you can't kill yourself, and it's going to be based on some single god that is the monad of the gods mentioned in the second one. So there's a multitude of gods of which we are possessions. And then there's going to, but those gods, they all depend on some prior god. And it's going to be about that god. And furthermore, that God is somehow connected to initiation, to freedom, right? And
Hmm.
to initiating the soul. So that's like what Proclus manages to establish about what the argument should look like, um, independent of the actual like before he goes in and interprets it, which he starts in the next.
Hmm. Okay. Now, guided by these principles, we should have no difficulty in proving that the custody, I'm not sure, is neither the good as some think, nor pleasure, as Numenius says, nor the creator, like the demiurge, as the opinion of Pythagoras. But we
Mhm.
must hold with Hippocrates that it is of the Titanic order and culminates in Dionysius. Dionysus. Porphyry has already hinted at this in his commentary. Custody meaning like
Right.
who is the thing, who is the god under whose custody we are.
Yeah, I think it's yeah, the reason why we are in custody.
Hmm.
So some think, right, so let's get back to the text to talk about that. Yeah. Right. So it's this prison, right? We men are in a kind of prison that one must not free oneself or run away. So some people say the good or pleasure. Pleasure, we can see, is um, a very Platonic answer, right? In the sense that it's the idea that the senses, the life of pleasure, is binds us to this world. That's something um, that's an image that will show up in Phaedo later, right? That the soul is, as it were, nailed to the body through its pleasures and pains. Um, and it would be hard to see, however, why you must not free oneself from that. Right? The whole text seems to be you should free oneself. Um, that it is the good, right? You can also think that the good, and then that would be more in the sense of something like we all desire the good, we should all do the good, and therefore we shouldn't abandon our post. That would make sense of this text. However, what Proclus just said, what goes against that is probably the idea that the good is too high, right? The good is the cause of everything, and we need something that's somehow connected to a specific multitude of gods, right? And gods that we belong to as possessions, right? So that doesn't work either. Um, and the demiurge, again, what would be the issue with the demiurge? That we men are again, maybe that might have to do with not wanting a Gnostic view that that the world is a prison and that he created a prison. It could also be again that that a problem of it being too high or universal because it's not connected immediately with a multitude of gods that we belong, right? So in Proclus's view, the demiurge belongs to the intellective class, and that's and between the intellective and the cosmic class, the class of n cosmic gods, there's all the hypercosmic gods. There's not a direct continuity here. Um, why um why might we be I think immediately of the in cosmic gods here, because think of the Timaeus, right? So there we have the demiurge, and the demiurge he hands over the souls to the junior gods, right? For the junior gods to create bodies for them. And the junior gods, they take the elements that the demiurge has already created and they put them together to form our bodies. And those bodies, they have to eventually return those elements back to the wholes, right? That's why what they create is mortal. And so that might be like a point of support to say, we're looking for gods who own us. And there that language of taking and having to return is like a language of someone owning something. And so that's why you might think that it's the junior gods that are our guardians, right? Here.
Hmm.
And then he says it's none of these. Um, we must hold that it is of the Titanic order and that um, culminates in Dionysus. So since we're looking for the monad, it's Dionysus. This marries well because Dionysus is associated with the mysteries and with liberation, right? So it fits the 10th criterion, right? That it should be somehow initiatory. Porphyry has already hinted at this in his commentary. Says, um, uh,
What does the Titanic mean?
so the Titanic, right? So this is connected with the um, myth of uh, with an Orphic myth about how human beings came to be. So um, Zeus handed over the after created the world, he hands over the dominion of the world to Dionysus, and Dionysus becomes the king of this world. As I said, Proclus uses the expression "our Lord Dionysus." The Titans, however, are jealous and they trick Dionysus into play with some toys, including a mirror, which he stares into. And then they seize him and they rip him apart. And then Athena saves his heart, and that is like the noose of the world. And he gets ripped apart, and that's the creation of the world. So for Proclus, the Titans are gods that are connected with separation. And so they're gods that are connected with the creation of the body, of bodies, because what's proper to bodies is separation, right? Whereas souls and noes and everything higher than bodies has this property of being whole in the whole, whole in the part. It's proper to bodies that they have separate parts and that the whole is not in each of the parts. So that's and so to say that it's the Titanic is to say that it's connected with separation.
Hmm. Okay. Porphyry said that. Okay. And Xenocrates. Um, Creation. Should I continue now? Now,
Yeah,
three. Creation being twofold, either indivisible or divided. Indivisible is like the higher things. Um, the latter, according to the commentator, is ruled by Dionysus, and therefore divided. Former, the undivided things, by Zeus. Each of the two has its own multitude of subordinates, Zeus of Olympian gods, Dionysus of Titans. And in both cases, we have a monad as well as a triad of creators.
right. So the um it's so this is also in the Timaeus. So in the Timaeus we see the demiurge, he creates, as it were, the general structures of the world, right? And the eternal, the perpetual things. However, and this is what Proclus in the commentary on the Timaeus calls the primary demiurgy, the primary creation of the world. So it's as it were the structural engineering of the world. But then there's the secondary demiurgy, which is, as it were, the dividing of the creation of separate things in their separation. So, for instance, um, if the demiurge, determines that there have to be land animals, then it belongs to separate demiurgy that there has to be, dogs and wolves and horses and so on. So the separate demiurgy like the secondary demiurgy, sorry, is divided and it's produces the divisions of the world, not the general structures at all. Um, and and also like time, the division of time belongs to the secondary demiurgy in Prox. Like the fact that there is a time, there's a noose of time, that's what the demiurge creates, but then that, that there are going to be these, say, different eras, and that these are going to be divided into years and months, that goes down into secondary demiurgy. And since in the myth Dionysus is separated, he is torn apart, and I mean, and tearing things apart, especially tearing bulls apart, is something that, belongs to Dionysian cults since antiquity. And, in the Bacchants, the Bacchae, Euripides, there's the account of how King Pentheus is torn apart by by the crazy Maenads. So he's associated with division and ripping things apart. So he is the god of the world insofar as it's divided, right? And each of them has a multitude. So Zeus has the multitude of the Olympians, which here the idea is of so in Proclus, Zeus immediately has under him uh, Zeus again, which and has like the triad of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades that divide the world into three. Zeus has the higher part, Poseidon the middle, and Hades the bottom part. And we saw this a bit about this in the Cratylus when we discussed it uh, in the course on the essay on the Republic. And then after that come the 12 Olympians from the Phaedrus, right? And it's part of the Phaedrus that the gods there are said to rule the whole world. So Proclus says this shows that these are hypercosmic gods because they're not tied to one specific region. So like Hermes is mentioned there, but it's not the end cosmic Hermes, the Hermes of that planet. It's a Hermes that has an effect on the whole world, right? And so these are the 12 Olympians, and they're associated with the demiurge, right? However, the Dionysus, he says, is a god of division, and so below him are going to be apparently there's another demiurgic triad. We don't really know what that is, but you could think about something that divides the world into three. For instance, the sphere of the fixed stars, then the planets and the sublunary world, something like that, and then also a multitude of titans. And then maybe here the Hermes that is the god of that planet would be like a Titanic Hermes or something like that. So that is probably what Proclus has in mind here, and so he's applying um, the criteria that he saw. So he needs a multitude of gods for the second argument, and a monad coordinate with that in the first. It seems like that the multitude, since we're possessions, is something to do with the cosmos, since we're things for them, right? So as souls were not things, so it's like bodies as that were things that belong to others. And so that should be the um, so it should be the cosmic gods. The demiurge is too high, so Dionysus should be the monad that we're talking about. So the argument should that we are somehow in custody should be something about how we're connected to Dionysus, and that should be the key to understanding the esoteric argument for why we can't kill ourselves, right? That's the Proclean argument.
And
A little
Dionysus is this like more like he is also himself. It's, for that itself, there's a monad and a multitude, but that's the multiple thing of the exoteric argument, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So we'll continue next week with this reconstruction of what is this relationship with Dionysus and why should that say that we shouldn't kill ourselves? Right.
Hmm. Okay.
Um, so next week is fine?
Very important question. Yeah. Um, I guess, yeah, should be fine.
Okay,
Like there's an
great.
agreement between what's his name? The French guy and this. Like that the first philosophical question is why not to kill yourself?
Well, that's also part of the artifact that we lost the first part of this commentary.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Okay,
All
great.
right.
I'll see you next week. Bye.
Okay, I'll see you.